Okay, welcome as you're settling in. I'm Professor Rick Pildes. This is Professor Bob Bauer. We're here today to try to provide you some distinct legal and institutional perspective on the election. We're going to try to avoid talking too directly about the politics or the personalities and more to talk about areas in which we have actually distinct expertise. And we thought we'd try to focus on 4 issues, primarily in the hour or so that we're going to talk, and then we'll open it up for questions, kind of starting from the beginning of the process to the end of the process. So one thing we want to talk about as our first topic will be the primary election process, or the process more generally that we use in the United States for selecting nominees for the presidency. And I want to give you some historical and comparative perspective on how unique what we do in the United States actually is about that. The second area we'll talk about is the debate process, both in the primaries and in the general election, since the debate is going to be happening tonight, the last debate. We want to talk about how the debates get put together, who has the power or control over them, what role they play, different ways of thinking about how the debates might be structured. The third area we'll try to talk about some is what we're learning about the role of money in politics from this election cycle. And then the last area, going from the beginning of the process to the end of the process, we're going to talk about Election Day and the various issues that have been current about what happens in the polls on Election Day, issues about who's there, potential voter intimidation, making sure voters are who they purport to be, all of those kinds of issues that are very much in the discussion today. So let's start with the process of choosing the nominees for each of the 2 major parties for the presidency. And in some ways, I think this is one of the more interesting perspectives on how we got to this moment that we're at. And what I mean by that is one of the things that's really most stunning about this election cycle is to step back and realize that for both of the major political parties, we've had candidates, Donald Trump on the Republican side, Bernie Sanders on the Democratic side, who are essentially kind of independent free agents who, in one case, Trump's case, have actually succeeded in gaining the Republican Party nomination, and in Sanders' case, came remarkably close to actually getting the Democratic Party nomination. So, keep in mind, Sanders, for example, is an independent. He is not a Democrat. He's never been a Democrat. His party identification is as an independent. He's always been a kind of, independent actor. How can it be that the Democratic Party can come so close to having as its nominee for the presidency somebody who is actually not a member of the Democratic Party? Or on the Republican side, Donald Trump obviously represents a set of issues and philosophies and positions that in many respects are at odds with traditional Republican philosophy or with the establishment Republican Party views on various issues. And yet he's managed successfully to capture the Republican Party label and run, even though he is essentially a free agent, run as a Republican for the nominee. How could it be that the political parties in the American system have so lost control over this process that actors who are so disconnected from the parties are actually carrying their labels or coming close to doing that in the general election? And in some ways, this is a question about how the forces of populism in the United States, both on the left and on the right, have managed to get more and more control over the political process in the United States, represented by these 2 candidacies. So what I want to sort of help illuminate for you a bit is, as I say, how we got to this point, which is a point at which the nominees for the parties are chosen completely through this process of primary elections in the various states. More than 40 states use primary elections or caucuses to choose the nominees. These are purely, popular, participatory kinds of processes. As I say, the parties can't keep off the ballot candidates who may not be a party member or may have views that are very much at odds with the party's general governing kind of philosophy. And you take the process of primary elections for granted, no doubt, because that's the way we've run this process for a number of decades now. But both in historical perspective and in comparative perspective, this is a uniquely populist way of choosing the party nominees, and it has a lot to say about why our political parties have lost the power to control very much about this process, including who their nominees are. So the process that we have is not the process we've always had or always had in the 20th century for doing this. In fact, it's only starting in the 1970s that we shifted very dramatically to the system that we now use, in which it is primary elections that completely control this process of selecting delegates to the party conventions. And therefore, if you can marshal enough votes in the primaries, regardless of what the party hierarchy or the majority of the party elected officials might think, you can capture the party's nomination. What did the system look like before this change in the 1970s? And part of the reason I raise this is I want to raise questions for you about whether the system we have is actually the best democratic system for choosing nominees, or whether the older system was better in some respects. Many people tend to think of the older system, to the extent they know anything about it or have any image of it, is as a system of party bosses kind of getting together in smoke-filled back rooms and choosing the nominees of the parties for the presidency. But that's an exaggerated account of the way the system used to work for most of the 20th century. The way it used to work before the 1970s was that there were a certain number of primary elections that were used, and you could amass a certain number of delegates through that process. But it was never a case that you could amass a majority of the delegates to the convention simply through primary elections. There weren't 40 states with primary or caucus elections. There were a much more limited number. And the other element that was brought to bear on this choice of selecting candidates for the presidency was that the party figures, the other elected officials from the states and the national government who were participants in the party conventions, would independently have a say, apart from the delegates selected through primaries, in choosing who the nominees were. So this system was what was called a mixed system, in which there was a significant role for party leaders. And again, this is not just the party leaders in Congress. These are the party figures throughout the states, plus the elected party figures in Washington. The party figures had a significant role in choosing, but primaries and popular participation also was an element of the system. And what this meant was that candidates who wanted to challenge the party hierarchy had a path to do that. They could run in primaries. They could demonstrate there was a lot of popular support for certain positions that the party was neglecting. But they could never do that in a way that got too far away from the party's general philosophical or political kinds of orientations, because they also had to get enough votes at these conventions from the established party figures to be able to get over the hump and get nominated. So in this system that mixed a role for party leaders and party elected officials throughout the country and voters in primaries, some candidates ran more as kind of insider establishment candidates, some ran more as outsider candidates, but it was this mixed system in which both pieces had a role. That system came undone in the late 1960s as a result of the tremendous turmoil that took place with the Vietnam War, the Civil Rights Movement, the kind of collapse of the Democratic Party in the 1968 Democratic Convention in Chicago, where there were riots on the streets. And a decision was made to shift the system, first by the Democratic Party, and then followed by the Republican Party, to this system in which the process was completely dominated by the primaries. Okay, in many other systems of democracy, voters through this kind of process do not dominate the choice of the party nominee. So it's very common, for example, in parliamentary systems, that, let's take the UK just very briefly, to be the leader of the Conservative Party in the UK, for example, what happens is the elected members of Parliament choose two people to put to their party members for a vote. And then the members of the party choose between these two potential nominees that have been filtered by the party in Parliament as potential choices. And there are a whole series of variations on this. The Labour Party in the UK requires that you get 15% support of the members of Parliament from the Labour Party. And then the people who cross that threshold are put to the party members for a choice. So there's a filtering process in which the party figures play a very significant role in many systems in helping to choose the party nominee who's going to be the party leader and the figure who presumptively will be prime minister if that party gains a majority of the parliamentary vote. So our system is fairly unique and certainly far out on one side of the spectrum in using such a populist, participatory, voter-dominated system in which the party figures are so far absent from the process now that we can end up with candidates who can be this successful despite being essentially independent actors who are free agents, disconnected from the party structure, and even maybe the party traditional positions on various sorts of issues. And that explains a good deal about how we got to this point. One way of thinking about this is what would have happened in the old system with the kinds of popular anger, populist rejection of the establishment that is being channeled through people like Trump or Sanders. I think what would have happened, for example, on the Republican side, is you would have had someone like Trump run in primary elections, and that would have demonstrated very powerfully, the extent of this appeal within the Republican Party electorate. But then a figure like Trump would not have been the carrier of that force into the general election. The party figures would have had to acknowledge the force of those concerns, but would have thrown their weight behind some more traditional party candidate who would have moved over in the direction of Trump's positions, but been a more conventional, probably more electable nominee of the Republican Party. In some ways, you saw this happen internally within the Democratic Party with the ways in which Hillary Clinton, in recognition of how surprisingly strong Sanders turned out to be and the forces behind him, you've seen her move her positions over on certain issues in recognition of that. You would have seen that happen within the party conventions, essentially, in the mixed system that we had until the 1970s. And so I wanted to start there, and I don't know if you want to jump in and comment on that to give you some perspective on how we've arrived at this particular moment.
Right, there are a couple of things that strike me. I would just add to that account, which I think is absolutely correct. The first is that Trump is not only running outside the party system, he's running against the party system. So to an even greater degree than Bernie Sanders, though Bernie Sanders is declared independent, Trump is deriving significant political support and adding passion to his campaign by running against the leadership of his own party. Now, sometimes they provoke him to a higher degree of resistance or a higher degree of attack, but generally speaking, his message is, I'm not them. So he comes from without the party, takes the party nomination, and is still running against the party while being its standard bearer. And that's kind of remarkable. The other piece of it is that you recall that signal moment when there were other, the competitors to Trump and others within the party who were concerned about Trump as the nominee thought that the moment had arrived potentially for the party to assert itself at the convention, and potentially through a change in the rules to have made it harder for Trump to get to a first ballot victory, with the thought, which was probably accurate, that there was at least some chance, if it went beyond one ballot, that the Trump nomination could be stopped. And that didn't happen. Now, there are a variety of reasons why it didn't happen, I think, but one reason it didn't happen is because this general belief, assumption, however you want to put it, sort of normative judgment that voter preference should control was so powerful that it was very difficult for party leaders to understand how they would explain that the candidate who got 44.4% of the vote, I might be off by a decimal, on the one side of the point, but not by much, how a candidate who had done that well in a crowded field could somehow be stopped through a party mechanism that was designed, if you will, to filter out that candidate for whatever reasons, whether on grounds of temperament or readiness or for office or ideology or however that argument would have been made. Jim Caesar, who was a political scientist at the University of Virginia, capped it off very well, and who's, by the way, a student and actually a pioneer in the study of presidential selection processes, has said that we're at a point now where parties in the presidential election function like a public utility. They're there for candidates to take advantage of structures to advance their individual candidacies, but have relatively little role over it. And when we come to talk about the primary election season and the primary debates, and even campaign finance, we'll talk more about the vulnerable position parties find themselves in and where this may, in the future, still be a very pronounced feature of politics in the United States today.
I'm going to take the risk of reading you a slightly inflammatory quote from one of the political scientists who was commenting on this change that was made in the 1970s and how we select our presidential nominees, and his concerns about what might be involved in going to a process that took the party out of the choice process to the extent that it really has been removed from the process. He said that this new structure might lead to the appearance of extremist candidates and demagogues who, unrestrained by allegiance to any permanent party organization, would have little to lose by stirring up mass hatreds or making absurd promises. So this was the fear that some political scientists expressed about as I say, I think we all take for granted as how we choose our presidential nominees, because this is the way we've done it since the 1970s.
By the way, I should mention one other point about, I mentioned the Republican Party leadership and the dilemma some of them at least found themselves in at the convention, trying to balance what they thought was the party interest in potentially not nominating Trump and the popular will to elect Trump. But consider on the Democratic Party side, we saw this extraordinary circumstance in which the failure of the Democratic National Committee chair, as some saw it, as some read it, to evidence the appropriate impartiality in the choice between the Democratic frontrunner coming from within the party and the independent running from outside the party but with the party label for the first time, lost her job. Because the thought was that rather than, even at the margins, as some might see it, influence the outcome or express reservations about what the Sanders candidacy might mean, she was really responsible for having the party function as a public utility, rigorously impartial procedures to allow voters to make the choice that they wanted to make without the party in any way trying to influence the outcome. So I think it's a real measure in both cases, the Republicans at their convention and the Wasserman-Schultz controversy in the Democratic Party, of just how handicapped the party institutionally is in influencing the choice. And you can take the position that's good or bad. We're arguing what is, not what should be really here, although there is, of course, a robust school, and I think Rick has written on this topic a good bit, that says that we've allowed the parties to atrophy to a dangerous degree.
And one of the interesting questions, and one of the things we'll try to raise at various points here is, how might the system change going forward after this election? And so one thing that this discussion sort of raises is if one side or the other loses badly this fall, but in particular, I think if Donald Trump loses badly, will the Republican Party go through a process in which they seriously try to debate revising the process for choosing their nominees, and in particular, will they try to rebuild a role for the political party figures to give them more of a say in the choice of the party's nominee?
Well, the Democratic debate's running the other way because the Sanders wing of the party is negotiating for more popular control of the party process and the elimination of mechanisms to limit popular control, like the role of superdelegates in the Democratic Party. So you actually have the contrary push in the Democratic Party. Now, if Hillary Clinton is elected, how far those reform movements will go, that's an open question. There are a variety of factors that bear on that outcome. But it's interesting to see that, those debates could take very different courses, but there will be debates in both parties with very different perspectives on the role that party rules ought to play in the nomination of the party standard bearer.
So speaking of debates,
Yeah, speaking
do you
of
want to
debate.
take the lead and what
Yeah.
kinds of questions, issues to think about?
Yeah, so
within-
we'll trot through this relatively quickly, and then we'll open it up for your questions and comments. But just to go to the debates are really, if you think about it, something everybody takes for granted, but is an extraordinary quasi-public institution. It is not, of course, a requirement that candidates show up at the debates, but they do. And in fact, those who thought that Donald Trump wouldn't show up at the debates discovered that, in fact, he would, unless tonight he doesn't, but it seems like he will. And so candidates are generally believe that they should show up at the debates. And, to boot, candidates show up at the debates with extremely limited control over any of the material terms of participating in those debates. So the Commission on Presidential Debates, which is a private charitable organization or an educational organization exempt under 501c3 of the Internal Revenue Code, specifies well in advance of the nomination of the two parties which cities the debates will be in, which formats for each of the debates will be the determined format, how many minutes the debates will run, and who the moderators will be. Now, I will admit to you, when I represented the Obama campaign in 2012, and we negotiated with the commission and the Romney people over the debates, I was restive over how little control I had over these matters. So, for example, I would have liked to have some say in the cities, some say in the dates, some say in the selection of the moderators, because you're a candidate, and obviously one of the roles of the campaign is to put the candidate in the position maximally beneficial for the candidate to run in. But that's just not how it works. Now, of course, the candidates can pressure the Commission on Presidential Debates about moderator selection. So, for example, if you're a Democratic candidate, you may say, well, this particular journalist has a record of being extraordinarily hostile to Democrats or liberals, and on the other side, the representatives of the candidates can say that journalist over there has a record for being extremely hostile to, conservatives and, free market advocates. But in the end, while listening politely on the other side of the table, the representatives of the Commission on Presidential Debates make the decision themselves. And they also, in choosing the moderators, give the moderators, always selected so far from the ranks of the press, basically full discretion over the development of questions and the determination of the role that they're going to play. So, for example, tonight, Chris Wallace has said, I'm not going to be, whether that holds up or not, I don't know, but Chris Wallace of Fox has said, I'm not going to be a fact checker. I'm going to be a timekeeper. But as you know, for other journalists who've played this role, either they, of their own choice or under pressure, have concluded they should play a fact-checking role, that they're there not just to restore order, but to assure that it's an informed debate and the candidates are called out for gross errors of fact, or for, frankly, even from deviating in any way from sort of the discussion at hand, from failing to answer questions, failing to be responsive to the moderator. What is most striking, and it ties into the conversation that we were just having about parties and sort of the role that these various institutions play in our process, is the Republican primary process was a process in which, unlike the general election, which, as I mentioned, is really controlled and shepherded by the Commission on Presidential Debates, in the Republican primaries, the controlling authority was the media. News organizations ran the debates. News organizations determined who was invited to the so-called main event and who was relegated to what was called the undercard debate, which was not in prime time. And they made those decisions based on polling data. The party was completely out of it. completely out of it. As a result, just to take one example, a senior member of Congress, Lindsey Graham, and this is not an expression about whether he's a good senior member of Congress or a bad senior member of Congress, it's a fact, senior member of Congress who has developed expertise and a significant national presence in national security and foreign policy matters, never made it to prime time because he didn't show well enough in the polls. Now, of course, his answer was, well, how can I show well enough in the polls if you never put me into prime time? But he never showed enough in the polls, and the party could not arrange for a senior member of its own ranks to be on the stage with Ben Carson, Chris Christie, Carly Fiorina, and the others who appeared along with, obviously, Donald Trump, Jeb Bush, and others. Many others, as it turned out, but not Lindsey Graham. And so you have this, in both cases, for events that are really increasingly not only pivotal, but a requirement, essentially, of running a modern campaign. That is the requirement that you participate in the debates. In both cases, in the case of the Commission on Presidential Debates, and certainly in the primary case, you have these unusual arrangements for determining who will have the opportunity to make their case to the public, and on what basis they will be selected, and in what way the debates themselves will be structured to present the most informed debate. A last comment on this, because we've got one tonight. A number of questions, as you know, have been raised about the role of the moderator. Should the moderator be a member of the press? Is it a press event, or is it really a debate? If it's a debate, what kind of a debate it is? Do you need a live audience? And to give you an example of how quickly things move, a few years ago, or this year alone, when there was a working group at Annenberg that I was a part of that looked at reforms of presidential debates, and we were engaged in a debate with the Commission on Presidential Debates about whether changes should be made in the debate structure. The question that we raised was, well, do we really need live audiences? They have a tendency potentially to get involved in the discussion in a way that kind of affects the course of the debate and affects how people hear what the candidates are presenting. And the Commission on Presidential Debates said it doesn't really happen. It happened once, notably, in a vice presidential debate in 1988 between Lloyd Bentsen and Dan Quayle, in which Bentsen made a very cutting remark to Quayle, and the audience responded very loudly to it. But it normally doesn't happen, except this year. Except this year, in which no matter how many times during the breaks, before the debate, the moderator says, be quiet, be quiet, be quiet, be quiet, the audience is so engaged, and of course candidates have something to do with who's in the audience, needless to say, that all of a sudden you have a debate in which, or an event, if you want to call it an event, a debate, however you want to characterize it, in which the audience becomes a factor in how the larger television audience is hearing the exchange between the candidates and evaluating the strengths or weaknesses of what they're saying. So there will be a discussion, I think, after this presidential campaign about both these processes because they're so important, and yet they've evolved in a way in which unexpected authorities are essentially in charge of how they run, parties less so, candidates less so, and there needs to be probably some discussion about where we're headed, because everybody agrees we ought to have something like it. What should it look like? How do we organize it?
So let me ask you about the primary debates and what you said about that. So what's your vision? I mean, no one really expected that we would have that many candidates in the Republican primary.
Mm-hmm.
And obviously, it's extremely difficult to structure any kind of meaningful public discussion or public debate when you have that many candidates running. What's your view about how the selection, should there have been a selection process for the primary, the main stage debates? Presumably, we don't want 17 people up there. If we don't want that, what exactly is the alternative process you imagine rather than using these public opinion polls? Should the party completely be able to control who gets to the main stage? Should it be based on some sort of objective set of facts about how long you've been in office? How would that allow challengers or insurgents to get into the discussion?
Well, it's a very challenging design question, and I don't think the answer is to give the parties complete control, because then people would worry that the insurgents would get locked out. And that's obviously not and given what we've said about the role that insurgents are playing, the role of those not strongly affiliated with parties might be playing in the presidential selection process, I don't think that would be viewed as a particularly happy outcome. But I do think that there are two aspects to this that need to be addressed. One is, I don't know that the news media should be fully in control of this choice, because let's be clear, they have a set of other interests. If I were Bernie Sanders, I would call them corporate interests, that emphasize, different returns to them than perhaps to the voting public, like, for example, the entertainment value of the debates. And as you know, there's been a lot of complaining, not expressing an opinion about the merits of it, a lot of complaining that Donald Trump received vast amounts of airtime, not because he was saying anything particularly interesting on any particular occasion, but because he was very good for ratings. And I think that, so if you decide you're going to have large news media corporations in control of this decision, and they can, by the way, adjust their criteria, which they did at least once to move Carly Fiorina into one of the debates when she fell out of the polling criteria. If they are in that position, I think you need a counterbalance. And it may be that you need the parties to have, call it a couple of ace in the holes, couple, joker cards, whatever you want to call it, where they can say, if Mitch McConnell or Paul Ryan is running, and for some reason they're not meeting the regular criteria, they can be included, not because they've been in office for a long time, but because of other benefits, other perspectives, well recognized that they would clearly bring into the discussion. I think there needs to be, that. But you raise an important point, which is that figuring out how that would be designed is very hard. And something similarly true with the Commission on Presidential Debates. They've done a wonderful service. Before them, the League of Women Voters, but for many years now, the Commission on Presidential Debates have done it. But that doesn't mean, and I certainly favor this, that we shouldn't be taking a hard look at how well this is working on the traditional model, because as the politics of the country changes, these kinds of quasi-institutional arrangements for organizing, the provision of information to voters really need to be reviewed as well. We just can't keep going on and on and on as if nothing has changed. So you raise an important design issue, and I don't have a satisfactory answer to it.
Well, let me also ask a question I'm curious about in light of your comments about the general election debates and what you said about moderators. So would you, or the Annenberg Foundation, which is a very reputable sort of entity that studies public debates and public processes involving politics, would you get rid of, would you have the candidates ask the questions of each other and have moderators there just to perform that timekeeping role, or what would be an alternative structure?
Well, this is purely speaking for me. There are people in the working group who probably have either similar views or different ones, or would emphasize some things differently than others. The question is it a journalistic event like an extended Meet the Press in which both candidates are present, or is it a debate between the two candidates? So in the first case, then you do want the moderator there to do the follow-ups, to make sure the candidates are really answering the questions, and maybe on some very careful basis, a fact-checking function. But if it is a candidate debate in which the candidates are given the opportunity for a nationwide audience 3 times, and the vice presidential candidate 1 time, to say what they want to say about who they are, whether they're telling the truth or not telling the truth, or being consistent or inconsistent, it's their case that they get to make, and then they engage the other candidate in a debate over that case, then I think the moderator, the role of the press is just simply not appropriate for that setting, at least as we think of that role today, which is to say, I think the candidates should debate each other. I mean, one of the models that the Annenberg group thought up, or didn't thought up, but adopted for this purpose, was the so-called chess clock model, where the candidates, basically, the moderator's there to administer the rules, but the candidates just go back and forth and back and forth. Now, obviously, that doesn't mean you're going to get an elevated debate on the issues. I think we've seen during this campaign that doesn't always turn out to be the case. But you have the candidates themselves engaged, and they're responsible for their own self-presentation and for making the best showing they can under pressure about their positions, the commitments they're prepared to make about the presidency that they have in mind to bring to the White House. And I think in that case, yes, I think that would be a better outcome most of the time than one in which the candidate believes that he or she's debating both the other candidate and the moderator. So, famous case, and this is, I was thrilled at the time, as you can imagine, because I was general counsel of the Obama campaign, and the ball bounced in my favor. So, being in, how would you call it, beautifully self-interested lawyer, I thought, bravo. But you recall when the moderator called out Mitt Romney, Candy Crowley called out Mitt Romney in one of the presidential debates for misstating, she claimed, President Obama's response to the Benghazi attack. Romney had said that President Obama had not chalked it up as a terrorist attack. Cindy Crowley said, I have the transcript here, and yes, he did. To this day, Republicans say she overstated her case. Well, then it ended up being between Candy Crowley and Mitt Romney. Right? I mean, the Obama folks couldn't have been unhappy about it because the ball, as I said, bounced in their direction on that occasion. But is that really the way in which we want these candidates to engage for our purposes, and is that really the best way in which the public understands, who they are, what their positions are, and how they would present them? So I do think more of a direct candidate engagement with somebody just, managing the rules has an important role to play. And then maybe one day, last thing I'll say is I think, if we want mandatory press engagement, if we wanted each candidate to have to go before a panel of journalists at some point, not in a debate, but in an extended hour and a half with 5 or 6 journalists selected by the journalistic profession to just grill them for an hour and a half and turn that into, as I said, some kind of informal institutional requirement, that's fine. I think that's absolutely fine, but it's the hybrid nature of the current arrangement, I think, that poses problems.
All right, let's shift and talk a little bit about money in politics. The third thing I said we wanted to discuss a little bit. So one of the things that's so interesting about this election that we haven't seen in a long time is partly about the role of new media or social media, and partly a result of the fact that one campaign, the Clinton campaign, has so massively outraised the other campaign, the Trump campaign, that we're actually having an experience that we haven't really had before of one side completely dominating the traditional airwaves, the traditional television ads in many, many states and in many of the swing states in particular. So, the Trump campaign has been structured around an idea that he can reach a mass audience through these rallies, through his access to cable media, command of that, and through new social media, through Twitter. And they didn't raise, he said at the beginning, he didn't believe they needed to spend all this money on traditional election ads. He didn't do it in the primaries. They basically aren't doing it in the general election. And so while we usually talk about all the amounts of money in politics and how should we think about this and the role of corporate money or union money, here we have something really unusual. And it's going to be extremely interesting to see how much this makes a difference or appears to make a difference. There are some people who have been saying, some political scientists who have been saying that these traditional political ads are waning in importance, that lots of people obviously are not watching television, cable, broadcast television, traditional network television in real time. They're seeing things on their computer later. They filter out the ads. That campaigns are going to have to reach people through different modes of communication. Maybe there'll be much cheaper modes like Twitter or Facebook or the internet. Maybe that will reduce the cost of campaigns, since by far the largest cost of campaigns is the money for television ads. So this is really a very fascinating development in this election cycle. There's actually a story today in the New York Times, some political scientists beginning to try to analyze this. It's too early, but how much of a difference does it seem to be making in these swing states that she's so dominating the airwaves over him? What's your perspective on that so far?
Well, I think the campaign finance debate is partly distorted by the focus on presidential campaigns because you're absolutely right. I think there's some propositions about the role of money in politics that would be tested by the presidential campaign. But of course, we also know the effects of money are going to be very different down ballot. So the farther down the ballot you go, the more important, for example, I think it will still be that one candidate has meaningful resources and perhaps a competitive advantage in resources over the other candidate. But even in the presidential campaigns, I think we're going to find out very quickly whether we have misjudged, maybe not dramatically, but by some meaningful margin, we've misjudged in circumstances like this, sort of a high-intensity experience, like a presidential campaign, with voters who are actively engaged with the race, who are reading about it, watching about it, following it on new media, on social media. We're going to find out very clearly whether Trump can run a campaign that consists, exactly as you say, of get-out-the-vote activities, by and large accomplished with free media messaging. That is to say, no actual cash cost to the campaign. And it's going to be a real shockwave if it turns out, and again, this doesn't go to whether he wins or loses or whatever, but if it appears that he did better with this strategy than anybody thought he might have, I think it's going to rattle some assumptions, at least at this level, about the role of money in politics. And of course, it probably could also influence the debate after the election that has been, that we're likely to have, at least to some extent, about what kind of reforms of the campaign finance process we need, right? Because this experience is going to be one-sided on both sides. How important is money? Has big money and its impact been offset by these lower efficient means of communication that are available to practically everybody through the internet and increasingly sophisticated ways of using the internet to communicate with voters?
And another issue that we're of course seeing played out in Money in Politics is something we've been talking about in classes for a number of years. But another way in which the political parties have had a diminished role over time is with the rise of all of these super PACs that are getting these extremely large individual contributions in order to run ads supporting particular candidates. One of the things, many of the people here will know this, I see a lot of faces from my classes, but one of the big questions is, what's going on with all of that? How are the parties and the candidates interacting with these super PACs at this point? What's the future of that likely to be? As you know, I think you share this view, but my view is that a major contributor to the rise of these super PACs was the McCain-Feingold law in 2002 that shut down the ability of the political parties to raise large amounts or to raise any money really for beyond the money that there is capped that people can give to a party, the large money donations to the parties that the parties have been using for things like get out the vote drives and the like. When that money was shut down by McCain-Feingold, a lot of it then went to these super PACs instead. Now they're taken for, they were very controversial for a period of time. Democrats sort of wanted to keep their distance from them. Democrats then embraced them. In this election, I think there's roughly similar amounts of money. Is that right? Or is Hillary raising much more even through her super PACs than Trump is?
Well, on the presidential level, my guess is, and I don't know, I don't have the most recent numbers, my guess is that the presidential spending through super PACs is heavier on the Democratic side, but below ballot, below the presidential level, it's either even or the Republican congressional effort is more dominant.
So have Democrats made their peace with super PACs? Are super PACs here to stay? Is there any way to try to get more money flowing to the political parties rather than to these super PACs or to the campaigns?
I think in the near term, it's difficult to see, just on for a number of reasons, including the disinclination of competitors to disarm in an uncertain environment, that we would see super PACs decline in significance. I think there will continue to be super PACs. I think there will continue to be these tax-exempt organizations, 501c4, critics call them dark money organizations, that purport to be advertising on issues but are really trying to influence voter choice. I think we'll see these less regulated or lightly regulated mechanisms very much in play, partly because the parties are not an alternative, but partly also, frankly, for candidates, and again, this is a broad generalization, but candidates are interested in controlling their own space, right? They're interested in running their own message and funding it to the maximum extent in ways that they are comfortable with. And so for a lot of reasons, there is a level of commitment of their own fortunes to parties they're not necessarily willing to make. And to the extent that they can have effective relationships with organizations like so-called single candidate super PACs, that they have real confidence will operate effectively on their behalf, raising and spending unlimited amount of money, that is strategically an irresistible choice. So I think that as matters now stand, and particularly with the lightly regulated environment in which we're operating in, I think it's hard to see that this is going to change, certainly through the next midterms and presidential elections. Now, the presidential candidate Clinton has said the answer to all of this probably is nothing less dramatic than a constitutional amendment. Probably, she's right that it certainly frames the debate sharply. It's certainly not a fix that's going to occur overnight. And it's very difficult to see any consensus in the United States Congress for regulatory measures that would be effective in containing the growth of this kind of outside spending. Should we pop the questions now? Because
No, I think it's a little early for questions still, but we have one more subject I want to at least get on the table.
Rigged elections. Rigged elections. We're going to talk about rigged elections.
Well,
yes, we are actually.
Yes.
That's what we're going to talk about.
yeah, and in particular, I wanted one of the things is general counsel. Bob was general counsel to both of the Obama campaigns. I was a senior legal advisor to both of those campaigns. Neither one of us is involved in the campaigns this time, I should say, although Bob's partner, Perkins Coie, is general counsel to the Hillary Clinton campaign, which I wanted to make sure to disclose. But one of the things the general counsel does, it's very important, is oversee what's going on election day throughout the country or the weekend before the election for particular problems or problems that arise during early voting. Just to help give people a feel for this, what goes on in the polls on election day? What is the risk of voter intimidation kinds of issues? Who's there to monitor whom? How does this all kind of play out on the ground on election day?
Well, I don't know how the Republicans, or as institutional Republican Party, is sort of organizing their election day monitoring activities, but I'll start by saying it's wonderful to watch both parties bid the story up about how many lawyers they have deployed, because if one party says we're deploying 5,000 lawyers, the other party says, no, we're deploying 10,000 lawyers, and the other party says, well, that's interesting because we just recruited another 5,000 lawyers, so we're now up to 15,000 lawyers, and suddenly there are hundreds of thousands of lawyers. The lawyers are outnumbering the voters. You target your voter monitoring activities because you can't cover, obviously, 8,000 different voting jurisdictions in the United States, and you wouldn't want to do it. They're very heavily concentrated in battleground states, as you can imagine, although you do try, and through institutional Democratic Party presence, you frequently, and through, by the way, labor and other voting rights organizations that do excellent work in this space, you try to make sure that you're allocating resources to protect the right to vote everywhere, even in places that are less electorally consequential, right? In Maine or Massachusetts, which it seems likely Democrats would win, or pick a Republican state that a Republican is likely to win. The goal is never to put too much money on what you can do on election day itself. If you don't have all of the basics in place, if you haven't built toward election day, then election day just goes too fast, too chaotic for anything terribly meaningful to be done in the courts or even through more informal interventions at the polls. So our goal in 2012 was to send people out to the states in March of 2012, and they were there for months, monitoring election day preparations, getting to know and building relationships with election officials, trying to sort of identify early warning threats, try to put facilitative measures in place to smooth out the voting process. That's very critical. Yes, you have to have a litigation capability. As Rick knows, we did do in 2012 some 2012 election day litigation to extend polling hours and to deal with line issues, but you can't do a lot. And you're not working against election officials. You can't do that. You want to work, except in cases where you meet with extreme recalcitrance, which is very rare. You have to work with election officials. There's been some concern this year, for example, what about unrest at the polls? We had, some of you may remember, there was an organization, may still be in existence, that was making some noise about having to do aggressive election day intervention. It was called True the Vote. And True the Vote made a lot of noise, didn't show up terribly actively many places in 2012. But the way you deal with that is early on, you have constructive conversations with law enforcement. You go to law enforcement and you say, we want to work with you on a cooperative basis. We want to know who we should be calling if something develops at one of the polling places or in multiple polling places indicating a pattern across the country. What can we do to help you protect the voters in these circumstances on a fully nonpartisan basis? And these are conversations to which you would presumptively invite your Republican Party adversaries to participate in. This isn't a partisan question, it's a nonpartisan question of protecting people's legitimate right to vote and protect them in particular from acts of harassment or intimidation. So I'm confident all of that's being put in place this time as it was in 2012. But the key thing is, and that's obviously also true because of the extended periods of early voting in many states around the country, election day itself, if you're not prepared for it, your ability to adjust well on that particular day to have a meaningful impact is exceedingly limited.
And I should explain that in most states, a representative of each of the political parties is allowed to be in the polling station or in the precinct. And they listen, the poll workers could call off the name of the person who showed up to vote, or they watch the names be checked. They're typically there, they're observers. They're noting on their list who showed up to vote because that's an important resource for the parties in terms of their mobilization, get out the vote drive. That's how they know who's voted, who hasn't voted. And they can challenge the qualifications of some person who's shown up to vote if they have a justified belief. There are legal standards for this that vary from place to place, that person's not eligible to vote for some reason. So the way our system tends to work is to have representatives from each party as kind of monitors in the polling place, in addition to the official poll workers who are managing the election. I mean, one of the things that's odd also about the United States is that we have these voluntary poll workers who do this process. Many of them show up only for the presidential election, so they do this once every 4 years. Many of them will be new, they'll be doing it for the first time. A lot of the laws have gotten more and more complicated, and we don't have a kind of professionalized election administration that has developed the institutional knowledge and the expertise and that does this on a regular basis. So we have the voluntary poll workers, we have the political parties with their representatives who are there to try to protect the interests of each party. And then you have, potentially disputes can kind of go up the chain to higher and higher levels of state election officials, ultimately maybe to the courts, though it tends to be hard on election day. Sometimes you do get certain things done quickly in the courts, but that obviously is a tough position.
You raised one other important point, because I mentioned litigation and law enforcement. The other thing you have is just like messes, like you referred to, where suddenly you find out that in some jurisdiction where there's no ID requirement, the election officials are asking for IDs, right? Or there's a place is running out of ballots, and the election officials are overwhelmed and says, everybody go home, we won't have any ballots for another 2 hours. We had the niftiest computer program in 2012. It basically allowed you to go into any states, and it registered reports of irregularities and told you where the nearest lawyer was that you had. And so you would literally find out X location is saying they're out of ballots, and the line is getting very long, and then you'd know exactly who in this particular, say, county in Missouri could get there in 25 minutes and try to sort out what was going on. The Romney campaign, as you probably read at some point, had a similar program called ORCA. It's named after the whale, I think. It went black on them. It just failed. The software program failed. And that's tough, because you're navigating this sort of national experience of trying to get reliable information so you can target particular problems and solve them. You may not ultimately be able to help millions of voters, but you could help voters in locations that are important to you and not in meaningless numbers. So I just thought I would mention that.
Okay, so now let's open it up to questions for the last 15 minutes or so. There are microphones, so if you have a question, please raise your hand and she'll bring the mic over to you. I saw a hand over here in the front. Yeah.
Hi, thank you for a great discussion. Going back to primaries, I wonder what your thoughts are on the role that states and state legislatures might play on changing the rules. Obviously, state election law can determine the timing of the primaries and also have some role in limiting the candidates with filing fees and signature requirements. How might the states get involved in that?
Well, one place the political parties do still have a meaningful role is in determining things like the sequence of the primaries in the state. So states can't actually just decide we want to have our primary on this day rather than that day. So the national committees of the two parties establish rules and impose penalties if states violate those rules. So that's why New Hampshire and Iowa are always going first in the primary structure. And the way the parties penalize the states is if they jump the line, the parties will say your delegates to the convention are not going to be counted, or they're going to be counted at half their weight, not their full weight. So the parties play a role in that part of the process, but the states have a lot of discretion to decide how they will select the delegates to the convention, whether they'll use a primary election, whether they'll use a convention, whether they'll use a caucus, or whether they'll send uncommitted delegates to the party conventions. So there are still some states, Pennsylvania, for example, very famously, big state, it has a lot of delegates to the conventions, and Pennsylvania doesn't actually have a primary that binds its delegates to the convention. It reserves 54 or something like that of the delegates who are free to cast their vote for whomever they want to. So individual states could conceivably move more in the direction of Pennsylvania and decide to de-emphasize primaries, but it would be very difficult because the political culture we have is so strongly oriented toward this kind of very participatory, voter-dominated primary process that for any individual state legislature to talk about moving back in that direction would be probably politically very difficult. So it might be easier for the national party organization to say, for example, going forward, we're going to have 35% of our delegates be uncommitted delegates. They'll be party officials from the various states. They won't be bound in advance to any candidate. These are now called superdelegates. The parties could choose to have a higher and higher percentage of the delegates be superdelegates. Now that also will be very difficult politically because it pushes back against this culture of popular participation. But I suspect it's more likely to come through that route than through individual states. Just a second, the mic's coming.
Thanks. I don't know if there's any truth to this, but one of the explanations I'd heard about the rise of Trump and the number of Republican candidates there were this year in the primary was that there was a lot of money that was freed up and that money was being floated around many candidates, as opposed to if there had been more restrictions on where money could go, the donors would have coalesced that money behind one horse that might have been able to gallop faster than Trump. Is there any reason to believe that, or is there any reason to believe that that there will be more disarray by more money as opposed to as it goes to many places?
I'm sorry, your first part, I want to make sure I understood it. You said there was a view that because there was a lot of money to go around, could you just repeat the beginning part?
Yeah, the reason was that there was a lot of money to go around and the candidates could compete for it. So you had 10 candidates who were all competing for, say, 100 donors. And so those 100 donors were like, well, I'm going to give to this person. I don't have to pick one. We don't all have to coalesce our money behind one person. We can give it to lots of people. So whereas the party players you were describing before would have had power in picking a person to run against a populist character like Trump, the other major contributors, money contributors, also have a lot of power in picking who can run against a populist character. So if they are free to give money to anyone, they may not feel as compelled to coalesce behind one competitor. Is there any reason to believe this, or was I completely misled?
Well, no, I'll think, it's interesting, I never heard the question put quite that way. My initial intuition, I haven't thought about this in quite those terms before, is that doesn't sound quite right to me because, for example, a huge amount of money went to Jeb Bush. A huge amount of money went to Jeb Bush. So I wouldn't say he got the same kind of institutional rallying around him that, say, his brother did in 2000. George W. Bush really locked up. He did get a significant primary challenge from John McCain, but he, if you recall, he was sort of rolled out as the Republican establishment choice, and there was a lot of money committed to the candidacy. That wasn't quite true of Jeb Bush because the Republican Party is in a very different place now, so that kind of consensus is less likely. But Jeb Bush, got probably a couple of $100 million. Now, it is true that some candidates who otherwise would have difficulty amassing a significant amount of money, a competitive sum of money, could in a world of super PACs, and this was true of Gingrich in 2012, it was true of Rick Santorum in 2012, could wind up having a couple of, benefactors who can just, keep them alive, not with massive sums of money, but with, a meaningful sum of money and keep them alive during a period of time when they're not drawing a lot of money from multiple sources. But I don't know that I would view it's hard for me to see that that's the primary reason why Trump ended up where he ended up. But again, it's an interesting question.
Other questions? Oh, yes. Hey.
Hello, Professor.
Hello.
Speaking to the question about going back to the pre-1970s party selection process, two questions to that. One, do you think that's a practical approach in today's political environment where you have significant pluralities in both parties who very much do not trust the party center? Wouldn't any move to limit their influence result in those voters either taking their toys or going home or forming some other sort of organization that they would feel to be more representative? And number two, just a question of unintended consequences, because in 2012, the Republicans were very embarrassed by the continued candidacy of Santorum against their center nominee Romney, and then reformed their selection process to create winner-take-all mechanisms that were supposed to give them greater control to weed out the fringe. And all that did was allow a candidate who received a plurality of the votes to capture the majority of all delegates. So just throwing those out there.
So on your first question, yes, that's absolutely a very powerful question. Given where we are, I would say historically, how much there's been a movement over time to more and more primaries and more emphasis on participation and voter control, added to the massive disaffection from the political system in both parties that we're seeing now, how plausible is it politically that you might see any one of a number of kinds of moves that we've alluded to up here that might give the parties a bit more control over this process than has more recently been the case? I think that's a big question. I think that it may depend on the Republican Party side on whether Donald Trump loses and loses very badly and takes down a lot of other Republican Party candidates. So, if there's a sense of crisis, that kind of motivation might be sufficient to confront what would definitely be an internal, battle royale over who's going to control the future of these processes. So I think you're right to raise that question. I don't know if you want to answer the second question.
Yeah, the second question is, that's the biggest problem. The one conclusion you could draw from reform movements of various kinds over the last, 75 years is that they've never turned out at all like, or all that much like the people who sponsored them imagined that they would. I mean, it's just the way it goes. I mean, there are so many variables that cannot be anticipated that there just isn't any predictable relationship between the design of a particular reform and the effects of that reform in the real world. That doesn't mean you don't reform the political process, it just means you do so with an almost endless amount of humility, right? An expectation of embarrassment, failure, and frustration. So I think that point on unintended consequences is a fair one. On the question of political parties, and Rick and I have talked about this, I've represented political parties my entire career. I think that there are ways in which we can give the institutions of the parties as we find them appropriate roles to play. I don't think that there are any set of regulatory measures that we can take that will recast parties into a role that they played in the 1950s or the 1940s or the 1930s. You can't make that happen. You can't force that outcome. They evolve into roles organically based on other political conditions, based on the character of the political culture in which they operate. So the party system that we have today is very different than the party system we had 100 years ago. And there's nothing we can do to turn that clock back, and probably nothing we should do, because it wouldn't be responsive to contemporary political conditions.
I think we're getting to the end here, and since there are no more questions, maybe we should just bring it to closure at this point. So thank you all very much.
Thank you.
And